Okay, so here's the pitch. After making millions for himself and raising a son on his own, we're going to catch up with an aging Forrest Gump to see what he thinks of where we've been over the last 25 years and where we're going. There'll be great moments where he's confused by his smartphone, and these heartwarming scenes with his grandkids where he imparts his mother's wisdom. Heck, there might even be enough time to work in some political messaging about the current state of affairs. If you just threw up in your mouth a little, then you share my distaste for going back to the well. The funny thing is, you might not be able to put your finger on exactly what it is about conceptualizing Forrest Gump 2 that makes you feel so nauseous, but there is a reason. So, let's talk about relevance in storytelling. I'm author DC Ferguson, and this is the Worldbuilding Dojo. Before we get started, would you like to work with me? I've created DC Ferguson's reading group. You'll get free reviewer copies of all my books, and all you have to do is leave an honest review on Amazon. Sounds like a sweet deal, right? Well, come build a blanket fort with me, and let's be best friends. The link is in the description down below. Some stories are undoubtedly timeless because they capture a specific emotion or factor of the human condition that is true regardless of generation or time. I'd argue that it would be several generations into the future before The Breakfast Club stops being one such film, because it so imperfectly encapsulates the struggles of being a teenager regardless of your upbringing. There's a character here to identify with no matter who you are. Now, having just watched the recent Borat sequel, as funny as that may have been, even the biggest fans can't imagine that this is going to be humor that ages well. It would be like watching Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update from 30 years ago, brimming with old names from old headlines and not really understanding the joke, even if you lived through it. As we can see with the upcoming release of Stephen King's The Stand, which was written in 1978, you can re-release the same story, which was made into a 1994 miniseries, and still have it be relevant today. Unfortunately, I sincerely doubt when this went into production 2 years ago that anyone imagined we'd be watching the premiere of a series about an outbreak that kills most of the planet while we're stuck at home in quarantine during a pandemic. But, believe it or not, that's not the part of the story that makes it easy to retell The Stand. In actuality, the outbreak is the story that only shapes the beginning and sets the stage for the real meat, which is where everyone that remains after the pandemic is either headed to Colorado to meet Mother Abigail, or they're headed to Las Vegas to meet Randall Flagg. Both of them represent the direction humanity will go, the battle for our souls between good and evil. Now, why are we talking so much about reboots of old stories or watching film of the distant past? Well, understand that what you produce will be inspired by both the time you live in and the stories you grew up on. The tales that move you and the events you've seen will shape the stories you tell. After all, they're your stories, and who the hell else is going to write them? It can only be you. So the thing is, what will your story say? Much like a drunken, misguided tattoo you got, the meaning can get lost over time and the story can be one you can't or won't want to talk about. The problem we're talking about here is relevance, or how fundamental is your story. Do you want to tell a story that we can all relate to with a cast of characters anyone can identify with? Or would you rather cathartically make your ex a character in your book so you can kill them for taking off with your best friend? Do you want to make a statement about the nature of justice or your current belief about one political football at this point in time? By all means, don't think that I'm denigrating the quality of messaging or political punditry. There are many authors, mostly nonfiction, that are on their soapboxes right this second, shaping stories that talk about the here and now, this moment in time, and they're absolutely killing it. They can make a lifetime career off of capturing their feelings of the current moment. Storytelling, especially those intended to have a deeper meaning or message to them, however, are often better suited to universal truths. So, what's the biggest thing standing in our way to these great stories? Why do so many reboots kick us right in the childhood and make us groan when we hear about them? Believe it or not, one of the biggest culprits is how I'm reaching out to you right now. When you think about it, the biggest genre to suffer from the advent of technology is horror. I mean, at the turn of the century, a few horror films started dabbling with embracing the stories they could tell with modern technology, and they have painfully lost their relevance. The Blair Witch Project, framed as a series of lost tapes, featured documentarians as they followed the story of an ancient witch, and they themselves went missing as a result. It's actually handled very well. Honestly, it could probably hold up today, even if the ending sucked rotten eggs and the storytelling was all over the place. Another film of that time, The Ring. Well, whew, dear God, that didn't age well. Again, poor storytelling and a half-decent premise, but it follows a woman's struggle to survive a cursed VHS tape that, once watched, will cause the viewer to get a phone call that informs them of their death in 7 days. If I lost you at VHS tape, then you're exactly the generation that proves why modern technology makes for a bad cohort with storytelling. Technology levels up at a pace I don't think anyone was ready for, neither in the late 90s or now. The jumps we took to get here supersede any technological advancement progression in human history. This is literally like inventing the horse-drawn wagon and having cars 30 years later. What's even more surprising than where we are is where we're going, with things like neural networks, quantum computers, commercial space travel, and so on. Getting a story caught in the wake of that bounding technological progression is a boogeyman we should all respect as writers. I mean, I don't think the irony is lost too much when I tell you that when I watched The Ring for the first time, I watched it on DVD. I think that sums up my point almost by itself. The thing is, this has been true since the 1950s. This isn't a new phenomenon. Back then, cultural relevance was the collective fear of the atomic bomb. It literally painted all of media, from drama to sci-fi to horror. Why do you think Peter Parker was bitten by a radioactive spider, or Bruce Banner became the Hulk because of a gamma bomb explosion? These days, we know that being subjected to high volumes of radioactivity will cause cancer, and likely would kill the person long before they could cause mutations that would even resemble superpowers. As I mentioned, the hardest hit genre here has been horror, but how has horror adapted? I would say not well, but let's take a look at how technology has forced horror to split in 4 different directions. It's an interesting study because it shows what we as writers have to do to deal with this burden. The first path that we as writers can take, and something horror has done, is to wind back the clock. It's easier to address the elephant in the room by going back to before it ever got to the party. We see that in It Chapter 1 and the show Stranger Things. Both of them set the childhood tale of horror to a simpler time when parents didn't have a Find My Missing Child app on their phone that would wrap up the mystery in the first episode. Oh, it says here that Will is in town, but in a parallel universe called the Upside Down. Let's go get him. I mean, with a modern cell phone, that's got to shave at least a few episodes off the season. So, by placing the story in an era before there were cell phones, you can go back to a fear that was once universal, not knowing where your child was. Think for a second about how many horror tropes don't work anymore thanks to cell phones and the internet. An unwitting family buys a haunted house. Yeah, that house now has 5 1-star reviews from the previous owners about how haunted it is. The call is coming from inside the house. Well, now everybody has cell phones. The call is coming from wherever the person is. And 911 can't tell you that without a warrant. Or a group of friends takes a wrong turn and ends up in a weird place. Well, GPS does mess up, and as a matter of fact, I'm kind of convinced that Google Maps is trying to get me killed by murderous hillbillies. But, by and large, it is unlikely that a road trip across the USA is going to somehow misdirect you from the nearest Burger King to some creepy shack miles from humanity. Which brings us to the other trope of trapped in a game of cat and mouse with a deranged killer and all the phone lines are cut. You can make a call from basically anywhere, and if you're trapped by some weird hillbilly in farm country with no cell service banging on strangers' doors, maybe your problem started long before you met the killer. So, jumping back in time subverts all these gotchas that technology put in the way. The other way we can go, though, is to fully embrace it. We see this with recent movies that I rolled my eyes too hard to remember the names of. For whatever reason, and I think most audiences are agreeing with me judging by their poor performance, modern technology in horror just isn't that scary. When we have collectively accepted that we're inviting a robot into our living room that is perpetually monitoring and spying on our every word to some gigantic monolithic corporation, the idea of a ghost sliding into our DMs is almost laughable in comparison. The next path forward is to throw it into the dystopian genre, which we see with A Quiet Place, which, let's be honest, is just I Am Legend with more emphasis on the monsters. And while we're at it, Bird Box is just I Am Legend and The Ring having a monster baby. Basically, we're going to post-technology. The world is in shambles, and a bar of soap is worth its weight in gold. This is The Walking Dead. It's World War Z. All these worlds where the future is more bleak than our past, and technology can't fix it. And it's just this reason why they work so well. Heck, I probably should have just called this episode How to Not Let Technology Ruin Your Stories. But that brings us to the fourth and most important of all paths horror has taken to make itself survive the march of progress, and that's the real lesson in all of this. Great stories are built with a combination of great world building, compelling characters, and a great premise. Whether we're exploring the depths of a new relationship in a romance, or the tolls of a great war against the orcs, the beating heart of the story is a universal truth we can all attach to. Whether you see yourself as an Aragorn or a Pippin, someone in The Lord of the Rings is your spirit animal, for lack of a better term. This characterization is that you attach to them is not only as someone that you identify with, but as kin. You and this character are so alike, you'd be best friends. The way they handled the crisis at the center of the story, you would have been right alongside them, whether that means that you were in way over your head, or the only one with the courage to stand before the great evil. Even in a drama or romance where there's only one protagonist that you may or may not disagree with or relate to, watching their triumphs and tragedies is compelling. We're consuming these stories because it shapes both what we've seen in the world and prepares us to assess what we may have never thought of before. So, for today's example, we're going to return to the deep cut. You know how much I love it. And this time we're talking about the 1986 horror film The Fly, starring Jeff Goldblum and Geena Davis. Now, what's funny is that as we return full circle to the intro, this film is itself a remake of the 1958 film, loosely based on the 1957 short story by George Langland. Jeff Goldblum is Seth Brundle, a brilliant scientist on the verge of creating teleportation. Geena Davis is a journalist turned girlfriend that develops a relationship with the scientist she's covering. He's either about to win the Nobel Prize or he's a hack, but they fall in love. During his attempt to transport himself from one pod to another, a fly gets in the pod with him. The artificial intelligence guiding the teleportation sequence doesn't know what to do with the two sets of DNA and fuses them together. Seth slowly transforms into a human-fly hybrid. Now, that's the horror aspect of it. But up until recently, great horror was often flavored within morality plays, and this film is no different. At the heart of the story is the relationship between Geena Davis and her lover as he slowly becomes this monster. Though incapable of hurting her before, the insect monster he's becoming is prone to rage and cripples his thinking. The ending, while I won't spoil it for you if you haven't seen it, is both tragic and haunting, but also very human. Seth's last act, when he's at his most monstrous, is also the most completely human that it's heartbreaking. Unlike many examples of recent reboots that check your gag reflex when you hear about them, this remake is actually far superior to the original drive-in movie fare that so many teens flock to. The beating heart of the story is this relationship between these two characters when one of them is afflicted with nightmarish transformation. What's interesting about this is that we could change this to something universally understood, like, say, alcoholism, and the beats of the story, on paper, would largely stay the same. All of a sudden, this film is a drama instead of a horror, but the story can follow largely the same trajectory of this man becoming a monster due to this transformation, and how his girlfriend deals with it. Whoa there, DC. You're making a campy 80s horror movie sound like a romantic drama. Well, guy who talks to your monitor, you're not that far off. The line is drawn so thin here that we could cross genres very easily. What if Geena Davis decides that love conquers all and she's going to stick by Seth even as he degenerates into a human fly? Well, dark as that may be, that love conquers all message is actually the heart of the film Warm Bodies, and guess what? Despite having zombies, Warm Bodies is a romantic comedy about a girl that falls in love with a zombie in a dystopian apocalypse. It's not a horror at all. You can even take it in another direction with one of my all-time favorite films, Hellraiser. In it, Frank has lost his soul to hell, but after escaping, his wretched, decaying body requires blood to be whole again. His former lover when he was alive, Julia, begins luring men back to her place and killing them so that Frank can return to her. So even though Frank is an escaped monster from hell with no flesh, Julia becomes a monster herself by choosing to basically feed these people to Frank because she loves him. And this is just a side character in the story. You see how we can twist this around and around, jumping to genres as we please? That's because these stories all are using universal truths like love and relationships at their core. But if that's the case, why do we hate reboots so much? Why does hearing my take about Forrest Gump 2 make you sick to your stomach? Well, here's the reason why. Every single one of us, myself included, is guilty of the sin of hubris in storytelling at one point or another. Heck, there's an entire subreddit dedicated to people telling their stories to see if they were the jerk in it. With reboots in particular, there is a great hubris that not only is the writer capable of making lightning strike twice, but that they understood what was so enjoyable or fundamentally good about the original work that they can duplicate it. More often than not, they miss the mark. There's also a cynical part of me that believes that most reboots are only ever intended to be a cash grab on nostalgia anyway, so writing takes a back seat. But to that end, we're going to play a game of one of these things is not like the other. And this time we're going to do it with the Ghostbusters franchise. Yeah, I'm going exactly where you think I'm going. The important part is how we get there. So, I mentioned universal truths several times today. Let's look at some. You know I love a good chart. So, here we have some themes that are unique to the human condition. They are timeless and repeatedly come up in stories throughout every culture as far back as our history as we have record. Now, I just threw this together. There are dozens of others that could be up here. But as you see, we have love, family, the power of friendship. The one we want to focus on here is the basis for every team movie that we go to see, whether it's Avengers, Guardians of the Galaxy, or even Ocean's 11. Our power together is greater than the sum of our parts. When you look at the original Ghostbusters film, this concept is front and center in the narrative. Something weird is going on in New York City, and a pervert, two nerds, and a normal guy looking for a job are going to figure it out. When they find the answer, it's more terrifying than any man or woman in the city could have imagined. The police don't know what to do. The mayor is helpless. The only people with not only the knowledge but the guts to face down this threat are these four men. Alone, they'd die. Together, they're victorious. The second movie plays it safe and basically retreads this map, not changing too much. We split up the team, making them individually weak, only to bring them back together to defeat this new evil. They did, however, insert some messaging that basically amounts to be kind to each other. Nothing heavy-handed, but the message is definitely there, and this new evil feeds on the negative emotions of people. With the Ghostbusters reunited in the climax, they become a messenger, making the city save itself in an outpouring of positive spirit. Believe it or not, this story is deeply metaphorical and steeped in ancient tradition, even more so than the first movie, with tons of psychological meaning and symbolism attached, but I'll let you watch it and play armchair psychologist yourself. Now, before we get to the elephant, you know the one. Let's first jump ahead. This summer, before all this COVID nonsense, was going to feature the reboot of the Ghostbusters franchise just 4 short years after the last attempt. Just judging by the trailers, the buzz is one of excitement. People want to go see this movie, knowing full well it's a passing of the torch, a new story, with a new generation, and only a light attachment to the original, probably some cameos. But it looks good. I say that because when we talk about the 2016 Ghostbusters reboot, it's easy to get into the politically charged conversation about it, what was going on behind the scenes, the purposeful messaging, and so on. Despite the laundry list of complaints that people had before the movie ever even came out, have you actually seen it? I did, and it was horrible. Not for any political reason, not because it was an all-female cast, not even because it tried to be funny and really, really wasn't. The storytelling in this film is an absolute mess. Like a horrible, terrible mess. It doesn't speak to any universal truth whatsoever. The characters do not grow as people, nor as a team. Things happen, a bad guy wants to make a ghost army to bring about the apocalypse, but the Ghostbusters stop him. The end. That's really it. There's nothing more to say here, neither by me nor the movie. There was so much hubris on the part of the writer of this film that he understood what was so good about the first two, that he could not only duplicate it, but change the formula to an all-female cast and have the comedy still work the same. The truth is, the writing was all over the wall as this movie came out. Even the critics couldn't keep themselves from panning it. I mean, I'd like to believe that even with all the groans and the eye rolling that followed when this movie was announced or later when the trailer dropped, people are pretty progressive, for the most part. If your friends came up to you and said, yo, we checked it out, and despite all the criticism, it was really funny, then you check it out too. Word of mouth beats online trolls 99% of the time. But the fact of the matter is, this film was just bad. When you take out the heart of the story, when it lacks that universal truth that makes it resonate with your audience, something has to fill that void. For comedians on the nightly late shows, that usually gets filled with jokes that are timely, but also fleeting. Their jokes won't stand the test of time because they only reflected a moment, and those moments pass. But much, much worse than that is the absence of both the universal truth and or timeliness. Nothing fills that void. Vapid, empty dialogue, characters no one cares about, and CGI will never fill that void. What you're left with is a shell of the thing you remember. On the outside, it looks like the story you love, but inside, it's just hollow. I'll leave you with this little graphic I made, though we rarely discuss music here on the Worldbuilding Dojo. It is such an important part of my life and inspiration for my work. It's funny it took so long for me to have something to share about it. These are the lyrics to the second verse and the chorus of The Kids Aren't Alright by The Offspring. This is a marriage of timeliness in verse and a chorus that speaks universal truth. Anytime you need to remember how to keep your tales relevant and avoid the hollow shell, I hope this song plays on your radio. I'm kind of stunned that I had so much to say on this week's topic. I thought it was going to be a short one, that's for sure. I guess there were a lot of relevant things to say about being relevant. Yeah, you see what I did there? Anyway, in case you missed it, for the past 3 weeks, I've been doing episodes on the business side of writing, and if you're thinking of turning pro, you should definitely check those episodes out. In the meantime, thanks so much for everyone that has given any donations. This beautiful lady is Liana. She's 12 and on the spectrum. We're working with the Boston-based Needs organization to get this little lady a service dog. If you'd like to help out, please check out the link in the description down below. And while you're down there, don't forget to sign up for my newsletter. The link is also in the comments. You're going to get Cora Blake, Arcane Agent, totally free. You'll get cool news about what I'm working on in books and here on the channel, and it comes loaded with cool authors for fantasy and sci-fi. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear about new videos, and as always, I'm DC Ferguson. Now have fun and get crafting.